And after that, gives me great pleasure to introduce our next session titled The Twice Born. Aatish Taseer discusses his new book with Sandip Roy. Aatish Taseer is the Aatish Taseer is the author of the memoir Stranger to History, A Son's Journey Through Islamic Lands, and three other acclaimed novels. He spends his time between New Delhi and New York. Sandip Roy is a novelist and journalist currently living in Kolkata. His first novel, Don't Let Him Know, won the honor title for the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature and was listed for several other prestigious awards, including the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. If I may please call Aatish and Sandeep up on stage, please, to talk about The Twice Born.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. Welcome back to Kolkata, Atish.
Thank you so much.
You know, while I was thinking about our conversation here, I read recently, I don't know if you saw this, some group called the Hindu Sena.
Yeah.
So they issued a statement saying they wanted to celebrate the birthday of Queen Victoria because the British liberated us from Muslim rule, and therefore they needed to celebrate it. And I thought that, given that we are sitting under the shadow of Queen Victoria herself, what do you make of that? Tragedy, comedy, farce? What is?
No, it's not a completely invalid intellectual perspective. I mean, it was, for instance, certainly shared by men like Naipaul, who thought that after a long period of Islamic rule, which had its cruelties, its subjugations, its a certain amount of destruction, that the kind of intellectual renaissance that India had, especially in Bengal, was to do with that meeting of Britain and India, and that it was very fertile, and that it brought forth a kind of modern nation out of this period. So I think that I don't know how these people were expressing it, but it's something that I think is within the realm of intellectual thought.
So what was different, though, in terms of that meeting of India and Europe, as opposed to, say, the meeting of Turks and Persians and India, in terms of what it did to our confidence and the legacy it left on us, sort of psychically, as it were?
Well, as there's a line in the book, in fact, where an old pundit says to me, he said, everyone came through India. And he said, and these people would come through and they would become part of India. And he said, believe me, there was a great deal of destruction. I'm from Benares, I'm saying there was destruction. But he said, these British, they came and they put an injection in our DNA. And we've never been the same since. And so it's what he was trying to get at was this thing that runs through the book over and over again, which is this idea of which Tripathi, for instance, voices, that he says there was not just a challenge of arms, there was a challenge. He said their thought content was very powerful as well. And it's something Arthur Koestler was trying to deal with as well. When he's talking about the rape and the seduction, he says we ruled by rape, but we influenced by seduction. And I think what in different ways is being expressed is that there was something very appealing about this other culture, about modernity once Europe had broken free from a culturally specific world, and there had been this moment in Europe of the Enlightenment and the expression of certain principles that could be applied everywhere. There was a society that came into being that still holds a certain appeal, and one who almost every society, I would say the Russians were the first, were in a situation where they had to balance this business of what is ours and what has come from elsewhere, and they had to negotiate this road. They had to find some way that they didn't lose their sense of self, and at the same time, they didn't lose the richness of this meeting. And I find the Russian thing particularly interesting because they're the first people. Dostoevsky is the first person to make this question of what is ours and what came from elsewhere the subject of literature. And the Russians didn't, unlike India and unlike China, the Russians didn't have that much of their own. It was literally just a sense that we're not quite like you, and we'll defend what we are, even though there's a lot that has come from you that is exciting and interesting, and that is it kind of our destiny lies in being able to balance these two things, and yeah.
So for us, I mean, what you talk a lot in this book about is the way we have dealt with or not dealt with this balancing. You know, what you've talked about is the break that has happened. And do you think part of this seduction of the West, the appeal of the West, is responsible for what you call the break that happened with not necessarily your generation, but the generation before, with centuries of tradition before them?
I think what began to happen in India, which has been a very dangerous, destructive tendency, is that we began to associate modernity with the actual trappings of Western culture. Modernity and the West are not synonymous. The point of the Enlightenment, the point of what had come out of Europe, was that these were universal principles that could be applied. And suddenly, these two things became a kind of acculturation with the West, became synonymous with being modern. And if that becomes the case, then what one falls into the trap of imitating results rather than assimilating methods. And I think that on the ground, it creates a situation where people feel robbed of what is near to them, of their cultural allegiances, the things that they love, their language, their dress. But on the other hand, they also then fail to see the spirit of an idea and start to associate it with a particular way of looking, dressing, speaking, and it dwarfs your growth if you fall into that trap.
So what about you? When, growing up as you did in kind of the milieu that you did, we take so much around us for granted that this is the way things are, as opposed to the way things were. But when did you actually start, having this nagging feeling that there was a break, that there was, as you put it, a partition line running through you?
Right. So I became, what puzzled me was, and I say this in the book, is this idea that a previous generation, someone like of my mother's generation, she would not necessarily have known what was lost, but the memory of loss was very rich within her. And so when I was going off to be educated in the West, and there was this one more layer of Western acculturation that would be added to me, she had this kind of anxiety, and she's like, I want you to go to Benares. I want you to find out, what she described as secret India. And she didn't really know what secret India was herself, but she carried within her the sense that people had been culturally bilingual before, and that suddenly they were kind of culturally denuded. And what I feel with our generation was that the memory of loss itself had been erased, that we could no longer remember what we had been. So on the face of it, we were very easy. We were very comfortable, it seemed. But we were also full of incuriosity, of a kind of terrible isolation when it came to Indian reality. And that moment in the book when I find myself in this room full of Brahmins who begin to not chant as I like to, as one is brought up to think. They're not performing religious. They're having an intellectual discussion in Sanskrit about sphota, which is the relationship between sound and meaning. It's a study of Indian linguistics. And I thought, how crazy that this was not part of my education. How crazy that I consider myself a thoughtful, a person who likes reading, who likes the life of the mind, that I should know about the different Homeric schools, but that this side of what is so clearly an intellectual inheritance was systematic. We were sort of steered away from it. And I became curious about the mechanism that had steered me away.
So when you go to Benares and you see sort of Sanskrit as a living thing, as it were, with these people, it's a method which they're engaging with each other as opposed to saying prayer. But were you already studying Sanskrit by then, or?
No, not the first time. That was what actually began that moment where I left to study Sanskrit for almost 6 to 8 years before I came back to Benares, because I felt inadequate. I felt that I'd come into a world that I didn't have even the foundation to understand. And I thought, unless I go away and learn a bit more, I can't actually reckon with this world at all.
So what do you make now, we see all over people writing about mythology has become immensely popular in India. People are writing novels, reinterpreting the myths. People are writing about mythology. They're applying mythology to modern life and business practices. But if you are doing all of that without knowing Sanskrit, is that a problem?
Well, it is tricky because, the Sanskrit, like the bodies of what, along with Sanskrit literature, there's another parallel literature of reading, of the commentators. And so, for instance, one of the things that people like Sheldon Pollock would say about Wendy Doniger was that she can't read a commentary. She can has an intuitive or relationship with text. But text is not enough because this stuff was written 1,500 years ago, and over that period, there has been another literature that is a literature of understanding what was written. And if you don't have access to that, in a sense, the world of Sanskrit literature is closed to you. I mean, I remember when I was learning, one of the things my teacher kept saying to me was, he says, I just want to get you to the point where Malinatha can teach you the Kumara Sambhavam. And if you get there, then that's perfect. And that is where he got me.
So when Aatish goes to Benares, he meets all kinds of people there, and the book Twice Born details those encounters. But broadly speaking, there were two kinds of people. There were scholars who were spending a lifetime, sometimes very exquisitely specialized. So you meet someone who's been studying the Samaveda for his entire life. And then you meet a lot of young people who come from villages, and they are studying Sanskrit, as you say, not out of a sense of, more out of piety than that intellectual curiosity you're talking about. So I won't talk about both of them, but first these young people, who mostly men, who coming from villages. What did they want from life? What happened to them after they'd finished studying Sanskrit in Benares?
They were in despair, Sandeep. They wanted the things of the world. They wanted Western fashions and jobs. They wanted their education to amount to something. And of course, they carried within them the sense that what they had was valuable, that it was part of a tradition that had carried on for a long time, that they were doing something that was that they could not separate from the idea of religious obligation. There was all of that, but they couldn't ignore the fact that they were coming into a modern scenario where these things were of no value. And anybody who has an education, no matter how rich, that is treated with contempt in the world that they're coming into, is going to find themselves on the back foot. And so what was happening in a funny way is that they were, much of the frustration of cultural loss was being channeled into politics. So politics was a good way, because at the same time, whether it was the ABVP or the RSS and these groups that these people were becoming part of, it was offering them an opportunity to regain the glories of the past.
But really?
Well, not really, but it could seem that way. It was
at least valuing that past, calling it worthwhile in a way.
Certainly. And the RSS will often tell you that their project is much more cultural than political, and that the politics is merely something that's that they've kind of that becomes an expression of this deeper cultural thing. So a lot of these younger people in the book find themselves attracted to this politics because these are the only people speaking to them. You know, yeah, sorry.
No, so in a way, these young people who are studying the Sanskrit, the past that many of us have had a break from, they are also stuck in limbo. They have their own partition lines running through them. But if indeed we had not had that break with the past that you're talking about, what might be a more constructive way where these people would find themselves fitting into a modern India, even with what they are studying now?
I don't know. I mean, if we take the countries where that break hasn't occurred in such a pronounced way, the Far East, for instance, I don't think that they've been necessarily harmed by not having a colonial experience. I feel in some ways that it certainly made them less accessible, but it hasn't made their relationship with modernity, it hasn't made that more fraught, it hasn't stunted their growth. In fact, I would say that Japanese or Chinese or now Korean meeting with the West has in many ways been more fertile than India's meeting. In the Far East, you don't necessarily get the sense that and remember, it was a very violent history, that relationship, and despite it, you feel that a kind of the sort of hybrids that we look for that speak to us of a meaningful cultural meeting have been achieved much more in the Far East than in India, which in a sense, there's a moment in the book where this young boy who's Tripati's brother, he's at the BHU and he studied Ayurveda for 25 centuries, and he's brought before the son of Madan Mohan Malvi, and he says, how are you going to do this? He says, you don't know. He says, what have you studied? He says, I've studied Panini. He says, but you haven't studied chemistry and biology, and you don't know English, and you haven't done all of this. And he says, what is there in the world that someone who's studied Panini can't learn? And Tripati says that this was his confidence. And I said, what was the source of that confidence? And he said, it's the simple confidence of knowing your own things before you know that of another culture. And in an earlier generation of Indians, you did feel that people were able, that Indian 19th century was much brighter than what came after independence.
So the other set of people you meet, the scholars. I want you to talk about, since we are here in Kolkata, I wanted you to talk about the former professor from Jadavpur University whom you meet there, and what drew you to him, what you admired about him, and where you realized that, that there would be this gap between you guys.
Well, this is Professor Mukhopadhyay, and he says very early on, he's very proud of how strict he is. So he says, right off the bat, he says, my colleagues like to joke with me, and he says, he's of a non-Brahmin background. He says, if I come and sit next to you, would you eat with me? And he says that there's no question about it. And so he says that he's rethought all of his views. He hasn't simply inherited the world of tradition, but he still has been able to imbue these beliefs with new meaning in his words, but that are very strong. They're very strong beliefs. For instance, he believes the food prohibitions that surround caste, and after traveling in the Indian countryside, the thing that I keep wanting to ask him is not the meaning or the value of caste, but the food prohibition. I want to narrow him down on this one point. And he stops for a moment and he says, well, in the West, you have this idea of physical uncleanliness. You have the idea that if someone had a communicable disease, you wouldn't let them into your presence. And he says, well, in India, we have an idea of spiritual uncleanliness. And I remember at that moment that this kind of like because I admired him in so many ways, but it was a deeply shocking moment, because suddenly I knew that I couldn't go all the way with him. You know, that as much as we found a kind of fellow feeling and there was a level of like human closeness, that there were things that were beyond the pale for me. And so what was interesting about that particular relationship was that idea of being able to admire somebody for being prepared to make their beliefs action, for willing to defend their beliefs, and at the same time feeling that there can be something repugnant about that moral certainty. You know, so and a lot of the book is, in a sense, deals with that idea of distance, that idea of how far you can go with someone and then not being able to go further.
Yeah, I mean, that is what's fascinating about the book, because for much of the book, you are sort of poised on that same fulcrum as Aatish is, where you witness, you know, it's easy to be shocked by and repelled against, you know, you see films about caste and you say, like, of course this is wrong, of course this should not be. But when you meet somebody like Professor Mukhopadhyay, who in another time, you know, you might have been a student at Jadavpur and deeply, deeply admired his
Right.
scholarship and his knowledge and aspired to be like him. And I should mention also that, what Aatish didn't say, that he might have students of a lower caste living in his house.
Yeah.
And so it's not like he's like all lower caste should go away. He's fine with them living in his house, but they must wash their own dishes. You know, that's sort of that's the way he thinks he's.
Well, his argument is, he says, you know, that I cannot tolerate an external criticism of my culture. In fact, one of the things he says against people, both Vivekanand and Tagore, is he says the West's India became their India. He said they took what was a Western criticism of India, assimilated it, and pretended that it was their own. And so he's very against what he calls liberal Hinduism, because he says that, and again, this is that question that the Russians come back to, is that how do you deal with foreign influence and at the same time not lose the energy of lose the idea of autonomy, of one's own cultural vitality? How do you still remain dynamic and at the same time you're being shaped by this other culture? And for him, what was important was rediscovering his own center and of taking these beliefs and giving them fresh meaning. And it remains to be seen to what extent that's possible.
Well, since we're talking about food pollution, as it were, and that separation around food, you have this harrowing story about when you come face to face with this idea, and it's one thing to see Professor Mukhopadhyay talking to you about, you know, like about food, spiritual uncleanliness, but tell us about the time when you are with the guy who's driving you around and how you dealt or didn't deal with this.
Yeah. So the moment plays out like this, which is that I find myself in this village in Madhya Pradesh, which is a purely Brahmin village, and my host is a young boy called Shivam Tripathi, and he takes me into his house and I'm staying with him, and something strange starts to happen, is that as far as I'm concerned, he seems not to recognize that I have a religion or a caste or any of these things. In fact, the only small indication he gives me is he starts to call me Nitish instead of Aatish. And he's doing what is, in his books, like this amazing act of generosity, which is that here we are eating with his family, and we have a Yadav driver who comes in and joins us, and the meal is going along perfectly, like seamlessly. And suddenly this tension starts to settle over the moment, and I can't figure out what it is. And finally Shivam leans in and whispers to me, and he says, you know, you have to tell him that I can wash your dishes as a gesture to a friend, but we can't wash his dishes. He has to wash them himself. And it's such a small thing, because anybody could do the dishes. But it was not anybody. It was him. And it was this weird moment when the implication of what is being suggested is bigger than the actual thing. And I freeze. I can't tell him to do what this guy has asked me to tell him. And at the same time, when Shivam tells him, he immediately crumbles and he says, I wouldn't dream of it. He says, Aap to hamare liye devta hain. And he goes out and washes the dishes. And it's just, it's such a small instant. And yet it means so much. And in some ways, Shivam himself, because pollution is not an individual thing. It's not like you're polluted. It's a Brahmin village. Pollution is corporate. The whole village is polluted. And so he's doing what is completely natural for him. Everyone is part of this system. But I find myself like chilled to the bone in that moment, and it's paralyzed.
Well, I mean, there are two things I've read that section multiple times, and I've talked to you before about it, and there are two things that strike me. One is, the kind of horror, at that moment I thought, what would I have done? And the answer is probably the same as Aatish. I would just have frozen and been paralyzed by it. But there are two things. One is the Yadav driver, perhaps it's a sign of progress that the Yadav driver at some level felt comfortable enough to join you for that meal. So that is some kind of progress in there. Right. Even though later he realizes that, okay, so much and no further. Right. But he did feel comfortable enough to join.
Right. No, look, I'm not like, there have been many systems in the world that have been in many ways more oppressive than caste. I mean, the serfdom in Russia was of a much, slavery in the West, in America. What I find is there's an intellectual horror because caste is, nothing has been worked out as well as caste. Nothing has been given a foundation as deep as caste. And the idea of the purity and the impurity of the soul is something that we don't often, we often speak of caste on the surface. It's not always that we come face to face with its intellectual underpinnings. And this was a moment where just the idea of it was so clear, like independent from it, the way that the idea is translated into reality. It was just the raw, abstract, like shock of what was meant there. And again, like how do you contend with that intellectually? I think that's what I'm, yeah.
Because in a way, like it or not, whatever our personal views on caste are, we do have a different sense of purity and impurity growing up. Jhuta, not.
Oh.
There are many ways. It may not always be related explicitly to caste,
yeah,
but it is something deeply ingrained in us.
Let me tell you, in Pakistan, where my father's family are from, I was in Sindh, and Pakistan had no contact with the Hindu caste system for 70 years. And I meet this Muhajir from Jodhpur who's working for a Sindhi feudal, for a landlord. And everything about India is wrong. The weather's wrong, the way people dress is wrong, the way people speak is wrong. And until the landlord finally tells him to shut up. And he whispers quietly to me and he says, मैं Rajput Musliman हूँ. I'm a Rajput Muslim. So I said, आपको शर्म नहीं आती? आप इंडिया की इतनी तंकीद कर रहे हैं और आप जात की बात कर रहे हैं, you're talking about caste? He said, I'm not talking about caste. This is about good and bad families. And you think, oh my God, like this country is steeped in fact, there was a very interesting piece just now by, I think, is it Faisal Devji? One of the people, who, a political scientist in the New York Times, saying that even the violence against blasphemy, 99%, the underpinnings of that violence are caste-related.
So, this led me to suddenly think that because we have this relationship with purity or impurity, in as much as we often like to say that in India, unlike the West, something like homophobia is actually a Western import, because we don't come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. I wonder if our version of homophobia is actually more to do with this idea of purity and impurity.
Homophobia? Why would you say that?
Because in some ways, our discomfort with homosexuality, is it entirely, we're sitting under Victoria, is it entirely a Victorian hangover? Or is there just this, thing of like, this is something jhoota, this is something dirty?
I'm not sure. I find actually the Indian attitude perhaps the most mysterious, because I used to have a friend who would come from the West, and he would always say that 99% of the guys he'd hook up with here were Muslims. And he had a little theory where he said that because it was a sin in Islam, you could also commit it. It had been like something that had been classified, and there was, the minute you have sin, you also have redemption, and it's something that's been, I find that that homosexual reality in India, it's almost like, it's kind of like it hasn't been classified, like it doesn't have a category, and people are not really sure what to do with it in that sense. So, like, I don't know if it has to do with purity. I find it something I'm not sure what the...
So with the people that you were meeting on the travel, do you think it would have been a greater transgression in their eyes if you had admitted to having a husband in New York versus a father who was Pakistani?
Well, I think that if I'd said I had a husband, as my sister said in Pakistan, she said, like, I think to have a husband in their books, it would have been like marrying a tree. And it would have just been something that would have been like absolutely absurd rather than horrifying. Whereas the Muslim thing, they would have known what to do with, and on the level of like, it would have produced a much more visceral reaction, especially to do with purity related to food and to all of those things. And like, I mean, if we go anecdotally, my mother was very worried, you're married to a man in America, it's gonna cause all this trouble for you in India. 99% of when I get attacked for what I write, 99% of it is, oh, you fucking jihadi, go back to Pakistan, Muslim. Like that shock that my mother would have had, like, firstly, not a marriage, but a relationship and a child with a Muslim is much greater than, like, in fact, it would be true to say that I've almost never received a homophobic remark in India.
So in this book, when you're writing about Brahmins and Benares, why did you decide you were also going to talk about your own sexuality? And the instance when you first talk about it in the article that you're writing is very moving.
Yeah, well, for the simple reason that in the course of this journey, which begins with the Modi election, and then it has this period of revisiting the scene of the election 18 months later, in that time, I've like fallen in love, got married, moved away, and because this is not a book like Stranger to History, which is a journey that is lateral. It's the book that Stranger to History, I am traveling in foreign lands. Here, I'm traveling in my backyard. I'm sort of excavating the distance that exists between people who are very near to each other. And in some ways, to bring that out, one of the things that people try to do is that they try to establish very basic facts about you, What is your religion? Who are you married to? What is your caste? And there's a moment early on with that guy, Pavan Kumar Mishra, where he starts to ask me about marriage. And at that point, he's using marriage because he feels like he hasn't found a single common point. He doesn't understand anything about my worldview. And so he thinks marriage, I mean, that's sort of universal. And I completely shut aside like any question of like same-sex marriage or anything like that. And he says, but surely the discussion must be happening by now. And I'm like, what discussion? And he's like, the discussion between the families. And I'm like, oh, wow, even this very basic point. And I was like, no, it's something that I would it's a decision I would make myself. And again, this very basic concept of marriage becomes like we have the same word for it, but the meanings have completely parted ways. And Yeah, and so I'm using these things to show how people very near to each other can live with this chasm of difference.
But at least now, if when people ask me if I'm married and I say no, not wanting to extend the conversation further, that leads to a kind of a stunned thing, like, you have gray in your hair and you're not married yet, what is wrong with you? You could actually, technically, completely truthfully say, हाँ, हम शादीशुदा हैं, and leave it at that.
Yeah, but it's a kind of a lie. I mean, it's
Ashwatthama, it's a little Ashwatthama.
Yeah, no,
Gaja.
and also also there's something very interesting about and this comes up in the book, is what is that underlying sense of apology? Because I'm not really apologetic about my life. I fought very hard to have the life that I have. I actually actively went in search of it. And when I think of somebody like my husband Ryan, I cannot imagine a situation, unless there was actually a physical threat to him in some way, in which he would lie about that. His moral landscape has a kind of unity to it. He's the same person everywhere he goes. Whereas I feel like in India, the way that I grew up, the freedoms of the West, which were so valuable, were things that I treated as if I had to kind of shut them aside and not defend them. And so there's this moment when I'm with Shivam Tripathi and he's telling me, you must marry an Indian girl. Indian girls are really good. If you're this much nice to them, they reward you with a lifetime of happiness. And I think like your views are diametrically opposed to mine. Actually, I find your views kind of contemptible. Why do I not have the courage to say, actually, he's willing to defend his worldview, but I don't have the courage to defend mine?
Why?
Well, this is it. This is what I mean about, I think the simple answer would be...
Because we don't think that, we're not sure on the ground on which we stand.
I think that it's coming back to where we began, which is that when you imitate the results of the West, but you don't integrate the values, you end up with the trappings of a life. But and in India, everyone does this business of living on different moral speeds. It's not just in gay life, by the way. You can be a man who's living with a woman out of wedlock. You'll tell some of your friends, you won't tell the servants, you won't tell your mother. Everyone is doing this little dance. And actually, it's very important to have a unified moral worldview. Because it's actually, you understand that the West is not simply about wearing these clothes or having a nice drink or about listening to some music, that there's a moral landscape that is far more important than the clothes you wear or what you... And it's something that, I mean, I've written about in the case of, I told you that I'd grown up with Vasundhara Raje, and one of the things that really appalled me when she was Chief Minister of Rajasthan, she's not now, is that when Pehlu Khan was lynched, I was like, and she was not prepared to speak. I was like, so really the West for you was a chance to have an extramarital affair, to have a little drink, to wear some West. That's all that it was to you when it finally really mattered. You were not willing to speak up for the one thing in Western culture or Western civilization or the liberal world order that actually matters.
Honestly, I think in our culture, yes, please, thank you. In our culture, I mean, we have, just as other people have heterosexual, homosexual, I think marriage is a sexuality unto itself in our culture. Because when people ask you, are you married, they are putting you in a certain place, and married and unmarried are just like homosexual and heterosexual. They are things that, otherwise you don't fit in the world view. But what I wanted, since you brought up the Vasundhara Raje and all of that, we go into a little bit on the politics. You say, as you say in the book, you start with the Modi election is approaching. And you've written that in 2014, you thought India was turning a corner. It probably did.
Yeah.
But what corner did you think we would turn, and what corner did we end up turning?
See, look, we have to separate these two things. The Modi election was on one level a political choice. And now, like, I've grown up in a political family. A political choice is not always ideal. Like, you're presented with two options. you vote for the one that's more dynamic. In that particular election, the other party had not even bothered to present another option. It was literally, it was for Modi to take. So forget the political side of it. The cultural side of it to me was important because I was very aware that India had lived in this period of custodianship that I've described, where the British had left, but an anglicized worldview, an anglicized power base, an anglicized culture had continued to dominate India in very powerful ways. And there was a sense in 2014 that India wanted to take a chance on itself, that here was this man who, whatever you say about him, was a tremendous achievement of the democratic process. And there was a curiosity, you know, for a long time people felt here that there was a kind of Indian genius or an energy or a talent that if only that could be unlocked, the country's real potential would be realized. And perhaps this was a fiction, but it was a fiction people were very attached to. And Modi was an expression of that cultural shift. And in the time, especially in those early years, there was a kind of cultural moment where people felt, on one level, very proud to be Indian. They felt that he was he was giving India a place in the comity of nations that was important. And they also, sometimes it was very crude, like the boatman in the book who says, you know, jab Modi aayega to sab kuch Hindi ho jayega. Now, obviously, that's him in a very crude way describing what he feels is an entrenched form of power in Delhi that they thought that they would shake off. And I thought that cultural shift needed to occur, that corner did need to be turned. Unfortunately, that has a political reality, and that political reality has been very disappointing. So I don't believe, no matter what happens in this coming election, that India will go back to that world of the family and of the world of the Mani Shankar Iyers and the drawing rooms of Delhi. Like, I don't think that India is going to come back.
But some obviously do. I just saw Priyanka Gandhi's entry into Congress politics being hailed as Hindustan ki Sherni.
It's very depressing. It's very depressing, Sandeep. Look, I don't love Donald Trump. But if now, after Donald Trump, you said to me, oh, here's Hillary again, I would say no. I would say no. That the electorate threw a bomb. And in a democracy, that explosion can be contained. But the anger of 2014 was real. And if you don't address that deeper side, that's not simply electoral politics, but to really understand what people are saying, and you just offer them the same option that they rejected 4 and 5 years ago, I think that for me, that's at least on one side a tremendous failure of the democracy.
You know, there is something very profound that one of the people you interviewed says in the book, and he says, "It is my ambition to be Hindu without vengeance and without apology." You know, both of those things. Was that your hope too?
It was very much my hope. It was very much my hope. It wasn't simply that I was worried about the violence in relation to India's Muslim communities, or it wasn't simply that. It's that if you become part of the politics of revenge, then you compromise the intellectual possibilities of what your vision could be, because it becomes then a negative vision. If the Hindu Renaissance is simply about killing Muslims, well, you're not going to have much of a Renaissance.
Or renaming cities.
Right. It becomes then, and that to me was the catastrophic failure of an idea of like Pakistan, was that it was an essentially negative project. No, Mr. Iqbal had not thought what his Pakistan would be. He had simply thought it would not be. And the failure of saffron politics, the politics of revenge, has been this idea that they didn't spend enough time imagining what the Hindu Renaissance would look like. They didn't work hard enough. They didn't read hard enough. They didn't have the intellectual foundation for what this vision would be. And so when it came for them to deliver culturally, once the economic stuff was compromised, they simply went about it in this ever more primitive way, culminating for me in the appointment of Yogi Adityanath, where you're really saying basically that you're kind of, then you're throwing this idea of renewal, of renaissance into the hands of like a murderous bigot, you know, and that really like just then.
But would it be but if your rhetoric up to that point had been built on this idea of oppression, like, oh, we have been oppressed for centuries, can you expect that the people, by the time you've delivered the election, people have been primed to want vengeance?
Perhaps, but a leader who, a leader with more intellectual power, with more vision, a leader who was not so limited, could have delivered. They could have channeled that anger creatively. It's happened before. A lot of historical situations in Europe have been born out of the most violent, angry situations, and that once change has come about, whether it is the French Revolution or later the revolutions in the 19th century, they were able to bring about new political realities. They were able to bring about a cultural like moment, which has not happened in India.
We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to give you guys a chance to ask a question. And somebody has a question right away, so let's go to her, and then we'll go to you.
My question is not in the context of the cultural renaissance as you spoke about with the uber nationalism, what's happening right now. Okay. This is truly cultural. My question is more in context of the disassociation of the cultural bonds that progressively is happening because either as a fallout of colonial education or the education that we are right now gaining in order to get better job prospects in the West.
Right.
But I feel my generation, and I'm pretty old, is the last, almost the last kind of generation with some sort of a cultural awareness, bond of a legacy. As I see my children and the future, I see more and more this gap widening. They have a lot less knowledge or understanding, deeper understanding of the cultural legacy that we have. Right. What, without the uber cultural RSS, VHP kind of a thing, what other methods can we adopt to get them back there is my question. Or is it a lost cause?
I'm going to answer your question on two levels. One is that I would say the vehicle for Renaissance after the old world has collapsed, and the old world will collapse, the unity of traditional Hinduism, which you'll see when you read my book in a character like Gyaneshwar Shastri, that cannot survive into the modern present. It will go, but in my view, the real opportunity for a group, for the Hindu political parties or whatever, had been education, that it would be possible to use intellectual curiosity to make the past enticing, to make it a source of wonder, to sort of, to not create this world where India, like, where people like me had been effortlessly, almost hardwired to reject what was ours and to show a parallel sense of wonder for the world of Greece and Rome, for all the things that were parallel with the ancient world here. We were full of reverence, but for our own things, and it was because our own things sit in, down the road in the museum in absolute dereliction, and on the level of education, the way that these things are taught, something like the sphota that I encountered in this room, it had been known in the West. René Daumal, the French Indologist, had written a paean about this wonderful study of science that like deals with the relationship between sound and meaning. My teacher at Columbia had worked to separate the different categories of Indian text, that the Veda was an authorless text. Itihas was a text where word and meaning were exact. In Kavya, there was a parting of word and meaning. And in that middle space was the area of play, and that was literature. And these were all beautiful, like ideas that could easily inspire wonder, not just among Indians, but among anyone who came into contact with them. But none of this side of what could have happened was done. What was done instead was something very, very pernicious, where people like Rajiv Malhotra, people who were not equipped to study these things, and certainly not in a position, not erudite enough to devise a new curriculum, to devise a world where we could finally get around to the question of, we had political freedom in 1947, we had economic freedom in 91. What if we'd had cultural freedom in 2014 of a meaningful kind? Those things didn't happen. And now, to answer your question on another level, is this idea of what happens when loss continues unabated? What happens when it all goes? Could it be a powerful, suggestive thing? Will people feel the lack? If they don't feel the lack, maybe they should just get on with it. Maybe you should kick it down the road. But the fact is that loss and absence can be suggestive. They can also be creative. In the West, the seed of the Renaissance, it was when Greece and Rome were dead that the possibility of Renaissance became real. And perhaps India will have to go all the way down that road before it's in a position to understand what's been lost.
Sir, yeah.
Good evening, Aatish. I really enjoyed reading the way things were. And I would make it a
Oh,
point
you
to read
like the
this.
twice born then as well.
Okay, I'll definitely make it a point to read this one as well. Well, my question is in relation to the point that you mentioned about uniform moral view, the fact that we always have to dance. Do you think that it is the surety of the beliefs of these people that we encounter every day that makes us question our uniform moral belief, our moral view?
Repeat that word, the what? The what?
The surety of the
surety,
the
okay.
surety of the people around us, the surety of their beliefs. You could say that we have been almost hardwired to think in that way, and that is why they are so sure about them, whereas we, the so-called Western educated individuals living in cities, have this particular doubt in terms of defending the values that we inculcated from the West while not really losing out from our own
What is your
roots.
name?
Ruru.
Ruru. Since we're in Bengal, I mean, we have only to look at the Bengali past to see the vehemence with which people were prepared to defend Bengali liberalism when it was something deep, when it had taken root here, when it was not associated directly, when modernity in the West had not become synonymous, and when people were able to feel culturally secure and at the same time deal seriously with what had come out of the West intellectually. I think people were prepared. You have only to read a novel like Gora to see how vehemently people were willing to defend these values. So this is not something that we've always had. I think what begins to occur is that when a real cultural alienation takes place, then people crave authenticity. And somebody who seems more authentic, you may actually want to reject his values. You may actually want to say, no. I really like the person I've become on this fault line with Western values, but one can feel cowed by the power of authenticity. And I think that's why that deeper relationship or that deeper kind of cultural integration was so important, because if you were culturally secure, you could very easily tell that person, perhaps in your own language, that you stand by these values and that these values are not negotiable for you. You know, so it's something, that sense of apology is very, it hasn't always been there, and one should excavate it, because what is behind that sense of apology? Yeah.
I think we're going to unfortunately have to end it right there. Aatish will be signing books, right?
Right.
So if you have a burning question that you didn't get asked, you can ask it while you sign the book. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Aatish.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Aatish and Sandeep, for a wonderful session. Aatish will be signing copies of his book at the Story kiosk outside the East Gate. We will need 2 minutes to set up the stage for our next session.